The call came at 9 in the morning. I was standing in the corner of a borrowed room, one arm twisted behind my back, fingers working at the final button on my wedding dress with nobody there to help me close it. I'd sent everyone away the night before because sending people away was easier than explaining what was actually happening inside my chest. My sister's name lit up the screen. I answered it with that button still open, still loose against my spine. She didn't bother with hello. Her voice came through soft and almost tender, the way it always got right before she did something that would leave a mark. "Don't bother waiting on Dad," she said. "He made his choice. He's standing with me." I pressed my free hand flat against the wall to steady myself. "How could you do this to me?" I barely got the words out above a whisper. She let a small silence sit there, and I could feel the smile moving through it before she even spoke again. "You always should have known your place." I almost believed her. I almost believed I was about to walk into that room alone. She was wrong. And so was I, but in a way I hadn't earned yet. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. I'm Nora. I'm 34 years old, and for 16 months I held my family together so quietly that not one of them noticed the hands doing the holding, not until I finally opened them and let go. I'm a visiting home nurse in a small Kentucky town, the kind of woman people call when the situation has gotten past the point where anyone knows what to do. This is the story of the wedding my family was absolutely certain I would walk into by myself. Leave a comment and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single thing that's about to happen. 16 months before that phone call, I was sleeping on the cot I'd set up beside my mother's hospital bed in her own bedroom because she refused to die anywhere that didn't smell like home. The ovarian cancer had taken her faster than any of the doctors had prepared us for. By the final stretch, I was the only one who kept the overnight hours. My sister Celeste said she couldn't manage it with her boys in the house. My father claimed he had a bad back, though he'd had that bad back only since the diagnosis. And so it was me. I learned the exact measurements of her evening medication, the precise angle of the pillows that eased her breathing, the particular weight of the quilt she needed over her feet even in summer because the cold crept into her from somewhere we couldn't reach. She kept a small ceramic dish of dried rosemary on her nightstand because the antiseptic smell of medical equipment made her feel like she was already somewhere else. That rosemary worked its way into everything I owned. My work bag, my hair, the collar of my winter coat. When she left us just before sunrise on a Wednesday, I was the one who sat with her until the room was fully light. I was the one who called the funeral home. I was the one who told my father, who sat down in the kitchen chair like his legs had simply stopped working. I was the one who chose the music for the service because my sister was too undone to finish a sentence and my father kept nodding at whatever anyone suggested without actually hearing them. And then, without any of us sitting down and agreeing to it, I became the one who handled things. The accounts, the outstanding medical bills, the subscription renewals, the insurance correspondence. All of it migrated to me the way water finds its level. And it felt, for a while, like a form of love. Being that necessary felt like proof of belonging. It took me a long time to understand those are not the same thing at all. You can be the most essential person in a family and still be the one for whom nobody sets an extra place. I didn't see it clearly then. I told myself that as long as I kept everything upright, eventually the people I was holding up would look down and see the hands beneath them. That was the error that cost me everything and then, eventually, gave me something far better back. I had convinced myself that indispensable meant beloved. Marcus came into my life on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon at the pharmacy where I was picking up a patient's prescription and he was returning something he'd bought for his mother. We bumped into each other reaching for the same counter pen and he apologized as though he'd caused a minor disaster. We'd been together nearly 2 years by the time this story reaches its center. He was a carpenter, meticulous and patient, a man who listened the way a good room listens, without echo. When I told him about my family, the full shape of it, he never once suggested I ought to do anything differently. He just made space and let me find my own way to the door. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening doing what I did every Sunday evening. I opened my accounts. I confirmed the scheduled transfer for the homeowner's insurance on the family property, the one my father's fixed income couldn't fully cover anymore after my mother's medical costs had quietly consumed the buffer they'd spent 30 years building. I moved money into the shortfall account for the property taxes, the same as I'd done every few months since the funeral. Then I navigated to my father's insurance portal, corrected the form he'd filled out incorrectly for the third time, and renewed his heart medication before the gap in coverage could cause him a problem. None of it was remarkable. That was precisely the thing. The labor that keeps a family stable is never the kind anyone documents or celebrates. It just exists, invisibly, like load-bearing walls nobody thinks about until they're gone. My phone buzzed while I was finishing up. A message from my father, chosen with the kind of excessive care he only used when my sister had been coaching him. "Sweetheart, about the wedding, the aisle, all of that. We should talk soon. Soon." He'd been saying soon for over a week. I turned the phone over so I didn't have to look at it and sat with my thumb pressed into the space between my eyebrows where the tension collected. Marcus looked up from his book. "He'll get there," he said. I wanted to believe that. But I had watched my father sidestep every hard room for my entire life, and a wedding ceremony is perhaps the hardest room there is. I should have paid more attention to that word. Soon. Celeste showed up at my door on Thursday, which meant she needed something. That was the only occasion that brought her to my side of town without advance notice. She blew in without knocking, her 2 boys ahead of her, her youngest barely 4 and already wrapping himself around my leg before she'd cleared the doorframe. Her older boy, 12, stood near the wall looking at his sneakers. Celeste had been just barely keeping herself above water for nearly 2 years since her marriage ended. The apartment she was in because I'd signed the lease alongside her so the landlord would approve it. I had never once mentioned that to her. She mentioned it often, in the sideways way people mention things that make them feel small, constantly and at unexpected moments, as though by bringing it up first she could control what it meant. "I feel terrible asking," she started. She always felt terrible asking. She needed $350 for her younger son's pediatric appointment, something insurance was being difficult about. I wrote the check. She folded it away without looking at it, and then she poured herself coffee in my kitchen and leaned against the counter and said the thing she had actually come to say. "You have a real talent for making every situation about yourself. Mom's last year, and now this whole wedding production." I kept my voice even. "I take care of what needs taking care of, Celeste. That's different from making it about me." She looked at me over the rim of the mug. "Dad needs his grandchildren close right now. You'd know what that's like if you had any." There it was. Right there in plain air. She had figured out the one thing my father could not endure, losing 16 months into living alone in a house that had stopped making the sounds a house makes when someone is truly at home in it. She controlled his access to his grandchildren. She had her hand on the one cord he couldn't afford to have cut. She kissed my cheek before she left, collected the boys, and walked out of my house, leaving me holding a check stub and the first fully clear understanding of what she was building. She'd located the single thread my father would never let anyone pull. And she was already pulling it, slowly, to see how far it would go. I didn't wait. People are always surprised by that part. That same evening I drove the 25 minutes out to the family property on the old county road because I have never been the kind of woman who sits with a problem she can already see the shape of. The driveway gravel sounded the same as it had my entire childhood, that particular crunch and pop under tires that meant coming home. The porch light was the only one lit for a quarter mile in either direction. I found my father at the kitchen table, the television on in the other room for company, a dinner plate barely touched. "Dad," I said, "I need us to talk honestly about the wedding." He wouldn't lift his eyes from the placemat. "Things have gotten complicated, sweetheart. They don't have to be complicated. You're my father. You walk your daughter down the aisle." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, the way he turned things when he was trying to find a way not to say something directly. "Your sister feels like the family is fracturing. She says if I cause a disruption, she's going to keep the boys away from me for a while." He said it quietly, but it landed like something dropped from a height. I kept my voice the way I keep it with patients who are frightened and need steadiness more than information. "Then let's bring her to the table. The 3 of us. Say the uncomfortable things out loud where we can actually deal with them. He shook his head before I'd even finished. I can't afford to push her on this, Nora. I can't risk losing those boys. And I saw the trap completely then, the way you understand the full shape of a current once it's already past your knees. If I kept pressing my father, I became the person who cost an old widower his grandchildren. Celeste had constructed it so that my advocating for myself would look, from the outside, exactly like cruelty toward him. I drove home with the gravel sound receding behind me and her words filling up the truck's cab the whole way back. You always should have known your place. I'd known my place for 16 months. My Aunt Patricia called the following morning before I'd gotten through my first cup of coffee. She was my mother's elder sister, nearly 72, the person in our extended family who treated her own opinion as a form of community service. Nora, I'll be direct with you. Patricia was never direct. She approached things in slow, wide circles. People are starting to talk. Celeste says you've gone cold on the family. I haven't gone cold on anyone, Aunt Patricia. I'm getting married. A long, elaborately wounded exhale traveled down the line. Your mother, rest her soul, would be heartbroken to see this kind of division. Can't you find it in yourself to be the bigger person here? I had been the bigger person at every hard moment for as long as I could remember. Every holiday, every funeral, every 3 in the morning. There is a point at which being the bigger person simply means being the designated absorber of everyone else's mess so they don't have to feel the weight of it. What is Celeste specifically saying I've done? I asked. Patricia, who fundamentally could not help herself, told me. My sister had been working the phone lines for the better part of a week. The version of me she'd been distributing around the extended family was someone who'd grown distant and superior since getting her nursing credentials, who'd been managing the family finances like a corporate overseer rather than a daughter, who had essentially decided she was too refined for the people she came from, and who had made it quietly clear that certain family members weren't welcome at her wedding. None of it was true. Every word of it was useful to someone. I understand, I said. And I did. I finally understood the entire architecture of what was being built around me. If you have ever been the person everyone leans into and no one steadies, the person whose first attempt to hold a boundary gets labeled selfishness before the words are even out, stay right here with me. What I did next didn't make noise. It just told the truth. Drop a comment and keep watching, because the morning of this wedding, something is going to swing open, and I want you standing in that room when it does. Here is what made the whole thing ache in a way that's hard to explain. We had planned to get married in the peach grove at the back edge of the family property. My grandfather had put those trees in the ground. I had played in that grove my whole childhood, climbed the branches, knew which ones would hold weight and which wouldn't. I'd pressed my first flower in a book I'd taken home from the corner of that grove. Marcus and I had put months of thought into it. Lanterns strung through the branches, wooden benches borrowed from the church hall, my mother's recipe for spiced apple cider on a warming table near the entrance because she had served it at every important occasion I could remember. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to stand at the center of that land and be the person the day was organized around. Not the one managing, not the one solving, not the one who slipped away to handle logistics while everyone else was still seated and laughing. Just the bride. I had let myself want it in a way I hadn't permitted myself to want anything in years. Celeste knew that. She had grown up beside me. She knew precisely which particular want, if threatened, would cost me the most. She began circling it in her conversations with Patricia and the cousins, dropping it casually like something she'd only just thought of. Isn't it interesting that Nora just assumed she could claim the grove for her wedding? That's family land, isn't it? It belongs to all of us. I told myself it meant nothing. The grove had been given to us. My father had agreed months ago, back in the season when he could still make promises to me without first checking whether Celeste would permit it. But a promise from a man who cannot survive losing his grandchildren is not actually a promise. It's a wish that has borrowed a promise's clothing. I lay awake calculating what it would cost to relocate a wedding with 3 weeks remaining and told myself I was spiraling, inventing problems. I was not inventing anything. I was simply arriving at the truth a little ahead of schedule. The gravel of that driveway, the rosemary that still lived in the curtains of my mother's old sitting room, the trees my family had gathered beneath for 50 years. Celeste was moving to take all of it, and she would call it protecting the peace. That night I did something I'm not proud of, and then something I am. First I opened my accounts and scrolled back through 16 months of transactions. The insurance payments. The tax deposits. The medical supply orders and pharmacy charges I'd quietly absorbed under my father's account so he wouldn't see the numbers and panic. The lease I'd co-signed. I added it all together, and when the total appeared, I sat back in my chair and looked at it for a long time. Then I did the thing I would later come to regret. I printed it. Every page. Into a clean, organized file. Statement behind statement, the entire invisible structure of everything I had been quietly carrying, made visible in black and white. I sat at my kitchen table and let myself imagine the family dinner where I would set that file down and open it. I imagined laying those pages out in front of Patricia and Celeste and my father and reading the numbers aloud, one by one, slowly, watching their faces shift as the true scale of what I'd been doing finally registered. I imagined them finally understanding exactly how much of their untroubled little world had been resting on my quiet work while they told the county I was cold. That fantasy was warm all the way through. It was the warmest thing I'd felt in weeks. My colleague and closest friend Diane, who had worked beside me for nearly a decade, came by for coffee the next morning, and I showed her the file. She let out a low whistle. "Nora, let them see. Put it all out there. Make every one of them reckon with what you've actually been doing." And I wanted to do it. I cannot tell you how much I wanted to. There is a specific, private hunger that lives in being unseen for long enough. A hunger that wants, just once, to make people actually look. I held that file in my lap the whole evening like something I'd been handed for a purpose. I went to sleep certain I had found the right move. I had entirely the wrong thing in my hands, and it would take my mother to tell me so. The call came on a Saturday, 10 days before the wedding. My father's number on the screen, but I could hear my sister's voice just beneath his, feeding him the words from somewhere nearby. "Sweetheart," he said, "about the Grove." I shut my eyes. "I think it's for the best if you find somewhere else for the ceremony. Let's keep things from getting more complicated. It's family land after all." "Celeste thinks," he started. "Celeste thinks," I said it back to him quietly. "Now don't read something into that." I wasn't reading anything into anything. I was standing in my kitchen 10 days out from my wedding, listening to my father hand over the one place that was supposed to be mine because handing it over required less of him than holding a position. Through the phone I heard the property's screen door bang. I heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of tires on gravel. Her car. She'd driven out to make sure he followed through. He didn't even stand up from the table to tell me. He delivered it sitting down with my sister's car in the driveway as confirmation. "All right, Dad," I said. "All right." I ended the call before my voice had a chance to do something I couldn't take back. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after. The Grove was gone. 50 years of my family's trees, the lanterns we'd planned for the branches, the warming table, the cider. Gone. 10 days out, in order to preserve a peace that had never actually been mine to keep. I expected to feel purely furious. What I mostly felt was that strange, almost floating lightness that comes when something finally breaks that you've been bracing against for so long that your body has forgotten what it felt like to stand without the tension. They had removed me from my own family's land. And I was still, that same evening, scheduled to auto-transfer the insurance payment that kept the roof above it from becoming a liability. The absurdity of that arrangement didn't escape me. It would matter more than I knew. Marcus found me sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the lower cabinets, which is not my usual place for processing things. He didn't ask me to explain. He just folded himself down onto the floor beside me, knees up, the way you sit beside someone when you want to be in the same position they're in rather than looking down at them. "We could have the ceremony in the backyard," he said. I went to bed that night still furious. I woke up with a plan I would have regretted. For 3 days I rehearsed it internally. Not out loud, just in my own head, in the shower, on my drives to and from patients. The speech. The file. I would walk into the family dinner my Aunt Patricia was already organizing, the let's smooth everything over before the wedding dinner, and I would place the file down on the table beside whatever she'd cooked, and I would open it and let them look. I had written the opening sentence perhaps 20 different ways. Before we say anything about family loyalty and what it means, I think we should look at some figures together. I had imagined my aunt's face going still. I had imagined my sister's composure cracking at the edges. I had imagined my father finally, seeing clearly the weight of what he'd permitted his daughter to carry without acknowledgement. In the version I rehearsed, I was composed and I was precise, and every person at that table was finally forced to truly look at me. To actually see me. I had wanted to be seen so badly it had become a physical sensation. I had the documentation. I had the moral clarity. I had 9 years of Diane reminding me that I gave everything and received nothing back in the same measure. And now I had the proof in a folder that had been riding around on my passenger seat like a silent passenger with a purpose. You always should have known your place. Fine then. I would show them my place. I would show them every single dollar of it. I was that certain. I want you to understand how certain I was, because it's going to be important when I tell you that I walked away from it entirely. I was one day from going into that dinner and releasing 16 months of invisible labor onto a table in front of every person I was related to. I had already decided. And then I drove out to the family property to collect some of my mother's things I'd set aside for the wedding. And my mother, 16 months in the ground, found a way to stop me. But first, Celeste wanted to meet. Just the two of us. Sisters, she texted. I knew better than to go. I went anyway, because some part of me has never completely stopped hoping that a door will eventually open in her that has been shut as long as I can remember. We sat in the corner booth of the cafe near the square, and she stirred her drink and looked at me with that evaluating quality she sometimes had, and within a few minutes I understood that this wasn't a conversation. It was intelligence gathering. She wanted to know if I was planning to do something. At the wedding, at the dinner, anywhere. Whether I was going to create a scene. She had guessed at the file, somehow, without knowing what it contained, and it had made her cautious. I just want to make sure Dad isn't stuck in the middle of whatever you're planning, she said. He's not in a strong place right now. You put him in the middle, Celeste. She gave a small, dismissive laugh. You genuinely believe you're the wronged one in all of this. Then she said the thing I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count since. Mom loved you more. You had the easy version of her, the gentle one. The mother I got was already tired and disappointed, and I never knew why. I sat across from her and felt something cold move through me because the story she was telling was so completely opposite to what had actually existed between us. I was the one who had been awake with our mother in the dark. I was the one who had managed her care, her comfort, her final weeks. I was the one holding the whole family in place while my sister quietly told everyone who would listen that I was remote and calculating. And yet somewhere inside Celeste lived a version of events that was completely sincere, in which she was the daughter who had been passed over and I was the one returning to claim something that had always been handed to me. Her behavior hadn't been strategic in the way I'd imagined. It was coming from somewhere wounded that had decided, long ago, on a story it needed in order to survive. That didn't make a single thing she'd done acceptable. But it told me something I couldn't ignore. She was never going to be moved by numbers. You cannot reason someone out of a narrative they have built their identity around. The file wasn't going to reach her. I just didn't know yet what actually would. I drove out to the family property on a Thursday afternoon while my father was at a cardiology appointment, the one I had scheduled and reminded him about twice. The gravel announced me to an empty house. I went in to gather what I needed from my mother's sewing room. The veil she'd kept folded in tissue since before I was born. The ivory ribbon she'd told me once, on an ordinary Tuesday, that she was saving for me. The small things a daughter carries forward when her mother's hands are no longer there to pass them. The sewing room still held her. Rosemary, faint and deep, absorbed into the walls and the fabric over years. Her old wooden sewing box sat on the shelf, the one with the painted wildflower lid that had faded from decades of handling, and I opened it the way you open anything that belonged to someone you've lost. Carefully, braced for what it might feel like inside. On top of the thread and the needles and the thimbles was her best handkerchief, the cream-colored linen one with her initials worked into the corner in tiny stitches, the edge worn smooth and soft from years of her thumb moving across it. And folded underneath it, a piece of paper in her handwriting. Not addressed to anyone. Just left there, the way she left things, small and true, tucked into corners for whoever needed to find them when they were ready. I read it standing up. Then my legs made the decision to sit down without asking me. Your place is not the seat someone else assigns you, she had written. It's the ground you choose to stand on. Stand on it, Nora. I don't know when she wrote it. Toward the end, I think, when she had watched the patterns already beginning to form, watched the family already moving me toward the corner I was apparently meant to occupy. She had seen it clearly. She had seen me. I pressed my thumb to that worn linen edge, the precise spot where her own thumb had moved for 30 or 40 years until the thread had softened from the contact, and something in me that had been held rigid for 16 months quietly, slowly, came down from its guard. The file sitting in my car suddenly felt like the most inadequate, most misguided thing I could possibly bring into a room. My mother had left me something better. I stayed longer than I intended. I was still sitting in her chair when I heard the gravel in the driveway. My father's truck, back earlier than expected. I should have called out to let him know I was there. Instead, I sat very still in my mother's room and listened to him move through the house that he thought was empty. He went to the hall closet. I heard the door open, and then a long silence, and then a sound I had never heard my father make before, not once in my entire life. He had taken my mother's old winter coat from the hook, the dark green wool one she had worn for so many years the cuffs had gone thin, and he was holding it against himself. I could tell from the changed quality of his voice, muffled and low, that he was talking into the fabric. I can't fight on two fronts, he said. I don't have that in me anymore. A pause. She's going to be fine, Lena. Our Nora is strong. She can take it. She'll land on her feet. That is the sentence that reached inside me and rearranged something permanent. Not the cowardice of it, though that was real enough. It was the calculation. He had looked at both of his daughters and quietly decided that because I appeared capable of surviving loss, I was the appropriate one to impose it upon. My resilience had become, in his accounting, the reason I deserved less. I sat in the dim sewing room and understood my father in a way I never had before, not with anger and not with absolution, just with a clear and complete understanding. He was a man who was grieving and afraid and had fastened himself to the only lifeline he could still feel, which was access to his grandchildren. And he was also a man who was in that moment actively, consciously choosing to let his daughter walk into her own wedding without him because maintaining that lifeline was easier than doing the harder, more honorable thing. Both of those things were true at once. They did not cancel each other out. I waited until he made his way to the kitchen. Then I slipped out through the front. The gravel announced me anyway, that sound giving me away as it always had, and through the window I saw him look up sharply. We looked at each other for just a moment, across the driveway and through the glass. And then he looked back down at the coat in his hands. He could not hold my eyes for more than a second. I stored that image carefully. I would see it again. I drove to my old 5th grade teacher's house that evening because I didn't know anywhere else to take what my mother had set moving in me. Eleanor Marsh had taught me when I was 10 and had never entirely stopped. She was 73 now and still the sharpest mind I had regular access to, with a front room that always smelled like something baking and a quality of attention that made you feel the whole weight of yourself being genuinely considered. She was the first adult outside my family who had ever told me I had value, on a day when I had completely failed at something small and felt enormous about it. She had knelt down and said something to me that I had been carrying around ever since. I sat across from her that evening and told her all of it. The grove, the file, my father and my mother's coat, the note in the sewing box. She listened the way she had always listened, without rushing toward a resolution, just holding the space open until I'd emptied it. Then she reached across her small table and covered my hand with hers. "Let me ask you something," she said. "That file. Who is it actually for?" "For them," I said. "So they finally understand what I've been doing." She shook her head, gently but without any uncertainty. "It's for you. You want them to be the ones who confirm your worth. But Nora, they're not holding it. They never were. I started to push back and found I couldn't find the words to do it with. Then what do I do with any of this? She gave me the same smile she'd given me when I was 10. You stop standing at the door that won't open and you turn around and look at who's already inside the room with you. She squeezed my hand once. You are not walking into this alone. You walk in with whoever has already shown up. I sat with that for a long time. Whoever had already shown up. Not whoever I could make accountable. Not whoever owed me a presence. Whoever had been there all along while I had been staring so intently at the ones who kept finding reasons not to be. I drove home with the file still on the seat, but I had stopped thinking of it as something I was going to use. Something else was forming. A better thing. The next morning, a man named Robert Tillman called me. I had cared for his mother Margaret through the last 3 months of her life, the previous winter. Long nights, difficult mornings, the particular intimacy of being with someone as they move toward the end of what they know. Robert had driven in from 2 states away at the last possible moment, and I had been holding his mother's hand when he arrived. Families do not forget the person who carries someone they love gently through that passage. He called to say he'd been thinking of her, that it was near the date, and he asked how I was. Because I was worn down and the wound was recent, I told him more than I'd planned to, about losing the grove, about needing a different place with 10 days left. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, Nora, we have the old tobacco barn on the property. We restored it after Mom passed. It was something to do with our hands while we were grieving. It's just sitting there. I started to say that I couldn't possibly ask that of him. You were with our mother at the end, he said, and his voice changed on those words. Please let us do something with that. Let us carry your day. It would mean more to us than you know. I sat down on my porch step and looked at the yard. What I want you to understand is that this was not luck arriving from an unexpected direction. This was a return on something that had been quietly accruing for 9 years. 3 months of cold mornings and late nights and a woman's hand in mine at the very end of her life. That is what was coming back to me now, in the shape of a restored barn with high timber ceilings and room for every person who mattered. You receive what you have given, eventually, and I had been giving to this town and the people in it for 9 years without once calculating the return. I told Robert I'd let him know, because I still couldn't quite locate my belief in doors that opened without being forced. But it had opened. And behind it, another idea was assembling itself, the real one, the one that would change everything. The family dinner at Patricia's happened that Sunday and I went, file still on the passenger seat, still half persuaded I might walk it inside. The whole assembled family was there, Celeste with her boys, my father at the end of the table saying almost nothing, Patricia managing casseroles and barely contained tension. I could feel the file in the car the whole time, like something holding its breath. Patricia began before the food was even distributed. Now. We are family and family extends grace. Nora, I believe you owe your father and your sister a measure of understanding here. And there it was, my moment, presented without any effort on my part. I could stand up and walk to the car. I could come back with 16 months of evidence and lay it out on Patricia's good tablecloth and let every person at that table see the arithmetic of what I'd been shouldering while they called me cold. My hand actually moved toward my bag where my keys were. And then I really looked at my father. Not a glance. I looked at him. He was staring at his plate, a man who had become somehow smaller than the person I'd known my whole life, a man who talked to a coat in an empty house because the person who had made the house make sense was gone. And I understood something clearly, with my mother's note still folded in the pocket of my jacket. If I read those figures aloud at that table, I would fracture him in front of everyone who shared our name. And I would be engaging Celeste on exactly the terrain she had prepared for this fight, the terrain of debts and grievances and who has claim to the title of victim. I would be turning it into a contest about money and visibility, and that was precisely the contest she would win. I moved my hand away from my bag. You're right, Aunt Patricia, I said, and I kept my voice as level as still water. Family extends grace. I extend it to all of you. I watched Celeste's eyes sharpen. She had come prepared for a confrontation and received something she didn't know what to do with, and that unsettled her far more than a fight would have. The file stayed in the car. I drove home and put it in the recycling without opening it again. I finally knew what I was actually working with. And it was not paper. Here is what I did instead, and I did it over 4 quiet evenings at my kitchen table while the town slept around me. I built my father a complete and honest handover. Not a bill. Not an accusation. A gift of genuine clarity. I compiled everything I had been silently managing for 16 months. Every account and its schedule, the insurance policy number and its automatic payment date, the property tax process and when each installment was due, the insurance portal login and the step-by-step instructions for the supplemental form he kept filling out incorrectly, the pharmacy accounts and the refill schedules, the contact information for every person I had been quietly coordinating on his behalf. I wrote it the way I write discharge instructions for patients who are going home to manage a complex situation on their own, because that was exactly what this was. I was writing myself out of a role I had never been formally given and never been thanked for. For 16 months I had been the mechanism that kept that household running, and no one had ever seen the mechanism because a mechanism that works is invisible by design. So I was going to hand my father every key to it, labeled, organized, plain. Not to shame him. To release us both. He could not keep leaning on hands he would not acknowledge in daylight. And I could not keep being structural for a family that described me as cold. It hurt to type it. Every line represented something I had done from love that had been received as obligation. But underneath the pain was that same strange release from the kitchen floor, the sensation of arms that had forgotten they were permitted to come down finally beginning to remember. When I finished, I had a folder again. An entirely different folder from the one I'd put in the recycling. Not the one that exposed them. The one that freed me. I set it aside to give to my father after the wedding. And I called Robert Tillman and told him yes. Yes to the barn. Yes to a room that wanted me standing in the center of it. Relocating a wedding in 9 days should be beyond managing. It wasn't. Because there is one thing I am better at than anything else, and it is organizing chaos under pressure. It is the part of being a nurse that becomes instinct. I made lists. I made calls. And then the most disarming thing happened. The town just moved with me. Diane coordinated the nursing staff into a volunteer crew for the lights. The Tillmans brought over additional seating and filled that old timber barn with warmth. A family whose grandfather I had sat beside through his final weeks arrived with flowers. The cafe near the square, the very one where Celeste had interrogated me across a table, donated the cider. My mother's recipe, because the woman who owned it had known and loved my mother for 30 years. Marcus built his arch after all and positioned it at the far end of the barn beneath the highest beam. Every call I made, someone answered yes before I had finished explaining what I needed. I had spent 9 years being the person this town called when something stopped working. And I had never once understood, until those 9 days, that I had been building something with all of that. A network. A foundation. A room full of people who would catch me the moment I stopped catching everyone else. The grove was behind me. What was in front of me was larger. I had stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that kept sliding away, and I had built an entirely different room, filled entirely with people who had actively chosen to be in it. If you have ever had to do that, walk away from the place where you were born into belonging and assemble your own version of it, you already know what's coming. And you know it is absolutely worth it. 2 days out and my sister was about to discover that the room she had designed for my humiliation had been replaced with something she hadn't accounted for. The room was already full. She just didn't know it yet. When Celeste began to understand that I wasn't going to fall apart, something inside her shifted into a different and more frantic gear. Her entire plan had been constructed around a specific outcome, her composed and self-sufficient sister walking alone into a sparse, half-attended ceremony, which would confirm for the entire county everything Celeste had been saying for weeks about a woman who had isolated herself through her own coldness. A bride without her father, without her family, in a borrowed space with strangers, was the story she had been building toward. But I wasn't going to be alone. And the word about the Tillman barn was traveling. The lights, the cider, the restoration of something that had been grief work transformed into celebration. So she escalated. She called the cousins and told them I had deliberately snubbed the family by taking my wedding to people who weren't even relations. She told Patricia that certain family members had been excluded. She put something oblique and self-pitying on her social accounts about people who forget where their roots are. Every move was another attempt to repackage the story, to put Sierra the cold one back into place. But the people who were filling that barn were not reading her posts. They were the families of the men and women I had sat beside at their most frightened and their most final hours. They were the nurses who had covered for me and whom I had covered for in return. They didn't have access to her version of me because they had met the actual one. The one who showed up. Celeste was telling a story to a room that had already spent years watching the reality. I heard from Diane that my sister had started to sound unraveled on the phone, the way a person sounds when the narrative they've built stops behaving the way they need it to. My father was caught between them, pulled toward the daughter who was loudest and confronted at the same time by the slow and undeniable awareness that perhaps the quiet daughter had been the honest one all along. I didn't let myself feel satisfaction about any of it. I kept stringing lights and confirming details and letting myself feel, for the first time in 16 months, that something was actually about to go right. Celeste could feel the outcome slipping, and so she made one final call, the night before, to me. Her last call the night before was the one that became the morning. But before she called, I had already done the thing I needed to do. That evening at my kitchen table I opened my accounts for the last time as the invisible mechanism of my family's stability. I deactivated the scheduled insurance payment for the property. I cancelled the tax transfer. I filed the formal documentation to remove my name as lease cosigner on Celeste's apartment, timed at the upcoming renewal so that no one would be left exposed mid-month. I wasn't doing any of it as punishment. I was returning the controls to the people who had been insisting all along that I had no authority over them. Then I emailed my father the handover packet. One sentence at the top, kept level, the way I keep everything. Dad, everything I have been managing for the house and for you is in this document. It is clearly labeled and completely current. You have everything you need now to handle it yourself. And so do I. I love you. Nora. I pressed send. I sat in the quiet of my own kitchen, 25 minutes from the property I had been keeping functional with my own resources for well over a year, and I felt a peace I didn't have a good word for. You should have known your place. I finally did. My place had been the ground they were all standing on. And I had just stepped off it, deliberately, in full daylight. The house wasn't going to collapse the following morning, but the people inside it were about to feel for the first time the actual weight of what they had been standing on all this time. My phone lit up. Celeste's name on the screen. I let it ring through. Whatever she needed to say, she could say it in the morning. And she did. 9 in the morning. The last button. The soft, deliberate cruelty in her voice. You already know that part. So let me take you through the door. The Tillman barn was lit like something out of a story someone good would tell. A golden October afternoon had settled over the property, and the old timber walls held the string lights the way good old wood holds everything, with warmth and without trying. The hay bales were dressed in quilts pulled from 3 different households. My mother's spiced cider was steaming on the warming table that the cafe had delivered that morning. I stood in the small side room the Tillmans had cleared and arranged for me to dress in, and I reached back and fastened that last button myself. The one that had been open since 9 in the morning when Celeste's call came in. I had managed it alone all day. I could manage it now. But alone, I was learning, is not the same thing as lonely. Not the same thing at all. My mother's handkerchief was wound around the base of my bouquet, the cream linen pressed against the stems of the wildflowers Marcus had gathered that morning, and my thumb moved to the worn edge of it and stayed there. The faint rosemary of her rose up from the fabric and settled something in me the way it always had. Your place is not the seat someone else assigns you. It's the ground you choose to stand on. Stand on it, Nora. Through the wall of the little room I could hear them. Not a thin, humiliated quiet. Not the silence my sister had designed for me. I could hear an entire barn full of people, the layered sound of 100 voices and chair legs and laughter, the particular warmth of a room that is full because everyone in it made a choice to be there. Diane appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless. Ready? It's genuinely packed in there. Standing along the walls. My eyes went hot. Who came? Everybody, she said, as though it were the most straightforward answer in the world. Every single person you ever showed up for. They all showed up back. I picked up the bouquet, the handkerchief, the rosemary that was already working its way into everything the way it always had. I walked to the doorway that opened onto the main floor of the barn. Someone gave a signal. The doors swung wide. And there it was. The room I had been told I would walk into alone. It was the fullest room I had ever stood at the edge of. Not a single empty chair. 100 faces all turning at once, and every one of them open, glad, completely and unambiguously glad. Everything Celeste had promised the county was going to happen to me died in that room without a sound. No speech required. Just a door swinging open on what was actually true. Eleanor was waiting just inside, in the blue dress she wore for important occasions, her arm already extended toward me. 73 years old. The first adult outside my family who had ever told me I had worth, and she had told me on a day when I had given her absolutely no evidence for it. Standing in now for every person who was supposed to be standing there and wasn't. "You are not walking into this alone," she said softly as I took her arm. "You never once were." We started down the aisle between those glad, turned faces. Slowly. The way you move through something you have waited your whole life to arrive at and don't want to rush through now that it's here. And that is when the barn doors at the far end opened a second time. Celeste stood in the opening, framed in October light. I watched something happen in her face that I will carry for the rest of my life. She had come, I believe, to witness the ending she had worked so hard to construct. To see her unreachable sister step into an empty room and feel the full exposure of having no one. Instead she found the room wall to wall with people. The cider steaming. The lights golden across old timber. A woman who had once given me worth on a worthless day walking me down the aisle on my arm. And not one single trace of the abandonment she had spent weeks guaranteeing to everyone she knew. Her eyes went wide and her mouth came open and nothing came out. And then, half a step behind her, hesitating at the threshold the way someone hesitates at the edge of cold water, was my father. He had come on his own. Without my sister steering him, for once. She looked as surprised to see him there as I was. He had read the handover packet, I would learn later, and somewhere in those clearly labeled, carefully organized pages he had finally seen the actual size of what I had been carrying without acknowledgement. And something in him had shifted enough to bring him here. He stepped just inside the door. And then he couldn't raise his head. My father stood at the back of that glowing barn and looked at the floor and could not make himself look at the daughter he had chosen to let down. Celeste found her voice then, too loud for the room, the way it always gets too loud when something has gone wrong for the side that was supposed to win. "Nora," she said, "this is all completely unnecessary. You always should have known your place." The whole barn went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it has just heard something that doesn't know what it is yet. I stopped walking. Eleanor's arm still in mine, and I looked at my sister across the silence and all those watching faces. I did not raise my voice. There was no need to. "I finally do, Celeste," I said, and I kept it as calm as my mother's hand on a worried evening. "My place was holding all of you up. I just set it down. No file. No figures read aloud at a table. No receipts laid out on anyone's tablecloth. I had left that instrument in the recycling bin where it had belonged all along. The ending didn't require it. The truth was already present in the room in the shape of 100 people who had driven here on purpose and 2 people standing at the back who were only now beginning to understand what that meant. Celeste's "you always should have known your place" hung in the air of that barn. And the barn answered it without any help from me. Because every person in that room could see, without a single word of explanation, whose place this was. I had built it. It was mine. My father lifted his head, finally, by a fraction, and his eyes were wet and he looked smaller than he had ever looked to me before. When he spoke, his voice barely carried across the room. "I read what you sent me," he said. "Nora, I didn't understand. I didn't know how much." His voice stopped working before he could finish the sentence. He didn't need to finish it. The man who had been unable to hold my eyes across a gravel driveway was standing completely alone now, truly alone, for the first time in 16 months. Because the person who had been quietly keeping him from feeling the full weight of his life from the shadows, had just stepped out of the shadows. He felt it the moment I stopped carrying it. And Celeste felt it move through her too. I watched the understanding cross her face, the real understanding, the kind that comes when the story you have been living inside starts to show you the parts it left out. She had spent weeks fighting me for influence over a man whose stability had never come from her. It had come from me. She had told me to know my place and had thereby removed the only person whose place was actually keeping everything standing. They had done it entirely to themselves. I felt no victory in it. Only a clean, quiet grief for the version of us that might have been, and underneath it something steady that I recognized as my own ground at last. Eleanor pressed my hand where it rested on her arm. "Shall we?" she said, and her voice was soft. And we did. We turned away from the doorway, away from my stunned sister and my diminished father, and we walked the rest of that aisle through 100 people who were completely, unhesitatingly, exactly where they wanted to be. Toward Marcus and the arch he had built with his own hands. And not one part of me looked back at what I was leaving. Marcus was waiting under that cedar arch. When Eleanor placed my hand in his, the whole barn breathed out and then broke into sound. We said our vows in a room that held the smell of cider and old wood and, faintly, rosemary. I kept my mother's handkerchief wound around the bouquet stems the entire time. My thumb found the worn linen edge whenever my voice started to lose its steadiness. She was there in the only way she could be, in the fabric that had been between her fingers for 30 years and was now between mine. Somewhere in the back of the room, I was aware of my father finding a seat on one of the hay bales and staying for the whole ceremony with his hat held in both hands. Celeste had gone. Slipped back through the October light the way she'd arrived, quietly and without conclusion. I let her go without a word or a feeling I needed to name. The vows were the only language that mattered in that room, and they were entirely about what was ahead. When Marcus kissed me, 100 people I had been quietly showing up for across 9 years came to their feet. The sound they made was the sound of being witnessed by people who have been paying attention for a long time and are genuinely glad for you. I looked out at that full, warm, glowing room and I thought about the morning. The button nobody fastened. The voice that came through the phone soft and certain that I would be humiliated. The absolute conviction I had carried that I was walking in alone. I had been so sure. I had been wrong in precisely the way you hope to be wrong once in your life if you're fortunate enough. My mother had understood it before I did and had tucked the knowledge into a tin with a faded wildflower lid for me to find when I was ready. My place was never the corner they were arranging me toward. It was the ground I decided to stand on, and the people who were already standing there when the door finally came open. I didn't walk in alone. I never had to. I only needed to stop staring at the empty spaces long enough to see how full the room already was. The weeks that came after filled in the rest of the picture. My father sat down with the handover packet and learned, document by document and account by account, the shape of what 16 months of being carried had actually looked like. The insurance came due and he paid it himself. Late the first time, on time every time after. The tax account, the insurance portal, the pharmacy schedule. All of it became his, as I had labeled it, as I had left it. He called me more in that first month than he had in the entire preceding year, and over time the calls gradually changed in character. They stopped being about what he needed and started being about nothing in particular. The weather out on the county road. A ball game he'd watched. My mother, sometimes. Near the end of one of those calls, he said, quietly, "I should have been the one to walk you down that aisle." I didn't offer him forgiveness and I didn't push back. "Yes," I said. "You should have." It was the most straightforwardly honest exchange we had managed in years. Celeste's leverage unwound on its own schedule, the way things unwind when the structure under them has been removed. She had built her power over my father on the threat of withholding his grandchildren, but a man standing on his own footing for the first time doesn't require someone else's permission for his own sense of stability. He had the accounts, he had the instructions, he had himself. The threat that had governed him for over a year stopped having anything to bite into. She didn't apologize. People who have lived inside a necessary story for long enough rarely do. But she grew quieter, and the calls to the cousins eventually stopped, and Patricia found that she had no remaining crisis to orchestrate. I held the boundary my mother's note had shown me how to locate and name. I give where I am met with honesty. I stop where I am taken for granted. I am still a nurse. I still drive out at 4 in the morning when someone in this town needs someone steady and willing to be present. But I am no longer the invisible structure beneath a family that described the structure as cold. Eleanor comes to dinner on Sundays now, sometimes. So do the Tillmans. So does Diane. The family I was born into became smaller and more truthful. The family I had assembled without realizing it became larger and more genuinely warm. And the two have found their way to a livable distance from each other. Out on the county road, my father learned to pull into my driveway on his own and knock on my door like a man who has decided to show up rather than one who has been sent. It took him a while. He's nearly 71 and still finding his footing in a world that no longer has my mother in it. But he comes now, and when he does he holds my eyes when we talk. The rosemary is still in everything. Her handkerchief in the drawer of my nightstand. The linen edge a little more worn now from my thumb where hers used to be. I take it out and read the note sometimes, when I need the reminder. Your place is not the seat someone else assigns you. It's the ground you choose to stand on. I stand now. In a room I built with people who chose it alongside me. And I have never once had to ask them to stay. If you take one thing from this story, let it be that. Your place was never the chair they pointed you toward. It was always the ground you chose and the people who were already standing there when the door finally opened all the way. The button no one fastened. The driveway my father couldn't cross until he had to feel what it cost him not to. The door that swung open on a room that was already full of everything I actually needed. If you have ever been the one holding it all in place while someone told you to know your place, you are allowed to set it down. And when you do, look around you. The people who matter have been standing right there the whole time. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and subscribe to Calm Drama Stories. I'll see you in the next one.